Welcome back to the MSU Deer Labs online seminar series brought to you by the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. I'm Bronson Strickland and I will be the presenter today. I'd like to also acknowledge my co-author, Steve Damaris, colleague of mine and co-director of the MSU Deer Lab. Today I want to focus on all of the aspects of getting a place prepared to plant for food plots. What are all the things you need to do ahead of time, planting equipment, etc. So that's really what this presentation is about, is the background and preparation for a food plot system on your property. Let's talk a little bit about the deer itself, its physiology, it being a ruminant and so forth, and maybe that'll again paint a little bit better picture for when I get questions, often misunderstandings about understanding what deer forage is. Often people will look out on the landscape and just see a lot of green, plants and think that there ought to be plenty of food for deer. But in reality, white-tailed deer fall on a continuum of ruminants, and this is just a real interesting schematic here, and interesting to me because I'm a deer nerd, of course, but I want you to make some comparisons here. Let's go all the way to the right, and this group of ruminants are the grass and roughage eaters, and even within that group we have non-selective. And if you look what animal falls in that category, it's domestic cattle. And because of that, we typically think there's an abundance of food. So think of cows on a pasture, lots of grass. They're not very selective, typically eating just a couple of species of grass. And what they have to do is eat a lot of it. And so relative to their body size, the rumen is really, really large to accommodate the amount of roughage that they have to eat. So this little squiggly line down here too represents feeding bouts. So they have far fewer feeding bouts, and at that time they eat for a long period of time so they can fill this big rumen full of roughage. If we go all the way to the other end of the continuum, we have white-tailed deer, and they're in a category that we call concentrate selectors. And that just essentially means they're a real picky eater. They pick particular plants they're going to choose to eat, and not only that, particular parts of those plants that they're going to eat. And when you look at kind of the natural history of deer, we think of them that they're a forest dweller. Sure, absolutely, you see them on the plains and things like that, but we really think their history, they're more of a forest species. Because of that, they have a smaller group size. And so think about really small groups of deer, single deer. They're not in these big herds like you see. And on the biological side and natural history side, a consequence of that is they have to remain diligent. So they don't have a herd in terms of all these eyes looking out on the landscape for a hunter or a predator. Rather, they have to kind of fend for themselves. And this strategy is that they eat and hide. And so they have a lot of different feeding bouts, and they will go and consume as much food as they can and then go back and hide, and then that is when they will ruminate or process their feed. I saw this on television one evening, and I paused it and took a photo because I thought it was a great example of what it takes to be a roughage eater. The context here, these are wild, free-ranging livestock cows, in this case in Australia, and this particular landowner and organization, they wanted these animals removed from the landscape, and so this animal was euthanized for that purpose. And I noticed when the animal is on its side, just take a look at the size of the rumen, the size of the stomach relative to the animal's body. And that's really what I was talking about in the previous slide. That is what it takes, is you have to have this huge fermentation vat to deal with the quantity of roughage that is in this case, a cow's diet. And so that's kind of a consequence of having the diet is affecting and influencing physiology and morphology, and they have to have this really big stomach to accommodate that. If you're a hunter, think about when you harvest a deer and you'll see it on its side. The stomach will not be near this big. Sure, the stomach will protrude and you can see it, but nothing at this level. And so here's a deer's rumen. Notice on the left, that's being a deer being a picky eater, picking particular plants to eat and the parts to eat, and that's the diet of a deer, going through and for the most part eating broadleaf plants, which we call forbs, versus grasses. And this is just the rumen and the parts of the stomach, the reticulum, abomasum, omasum, etc. And just notice the scale of it is so much smaller than, adjusting for body size, but the scale is so much smaller than you would see on a cow. One thing I'd like to note here, this is the cecum, is what a biologist would call it, but in a human this would be the appendix. And if you were in an animal like a horse that doesn't have a rumen, that's another strategy for dealing with really rough, fibrous forage, is they'll have an enlarged cecum. And so this will be a lot bigger on animals like that. And it's just another adaptation where they can increase digestibility from very undigestible forages. So to wrap this up, I would just like for you to keep in mind that deer are designated as concentrate selectors, and essentially what that means is, relative to an herbivore, a large mammal herbivore, they're a very picky eater. And just keep that in mind when the next time you're out and about, and whether you're in the woods or a pasture and you see all of this green material, all grasses, pasture, young growing forest, that just because the deer is an herbivore and can eat plants, it does not mean that it's going to eat the plants that are out there. It's going to choose specific plants and specific digestible and palatable parts of those plants to form its diet. If we look at what a deer eats on an annual scale, this is a study conducted by, again, my co-author Steve Damaris and Ken G. This was in Oklahoma several years ago. But examining deer diets over the course of a year, this is what they found, is that most of what a deer eats are what we call forbs. Again, that's broadleaf plants. That's going to make up 44% of the diet. And we like to say deer prefer forbs, deer need browse. Browse is making up about 35% of the diet, and often forbs are the first choice, and then they have to rely on browse, and a lot of this is during the winter or times when forbs aren't that available. Deer relish mast. It makes up a relatively small part of the annual diet, and they seek those opportunistically. When acorns available, anybody that hunts knows a deer is going to be drawn to consuming those. Very nutritious, lots of carbohydrates, lots of fat, so it's very advantageous for a deer to seek out acorns in the fall and winter to improve body condition. And lastly, we say deer use grass, meaning that that's the last choice. And people often say to me that I see deer eating grass all the time, and that can certainly be true. But I like to point out that they're typically eating grasses when all of the other preferred foods are in short supply or absent altogether. So we have two very different animals when we compare livestock or a cow to deer. Again, they're both ruminants, they're both herbivores, but what cows are selecting is very, very different than what a deer is selecting. So again, just something to keep in mind and keep in perspective.